Solving quadratics by factoring and completing the square. Reminder, an equation with highest power 2, that's a square, makes a shape called a parabola. We can find the zeros of the parabola. What's a zero? It's when y is 0, and when y is 0, you get the x-intercepts. So the zeros means you're going to solve the equation 0 equals x squared minus 4x minus 60. First thing you want to do when you solve a quadratic is see if it factors. This is the easy kind of standard form because the number in front is 1. Are there any factors of 60? Remember, the signs will be positive and negative because that number times that number makes negative 60. Are there any factors of 60 that subtract to 4? Yes, that would be 6 and 10. Now, reminder, the 6 and the 10 really don't subtract to 4. The reason I said that is because my signs are positive and negative. When you add a positive and negative, you subtract them to figure out that answer. I want them to add to negative 4 because really they add to negative 4. That means the 10 will be negative and the 6 will be positive. And of course, I need my x times my x to make my x squared. The solutions, or the zeros, or the x-intercepts, are the values that create 0. Because, for example, if x is negative 6 plus 6 is 0, and 0 times whatever x minus 10 is, and yes, you plug negative 6 in that, but 0 times anything is 0. This is a solution to that equation. The other solution is, what x do you plug in that makes 0 here? 10 minus 10 is 0. So 10 is my other solution. And again, 0 times whatever x plus 6 is, and yes, you plug in 10 there, makes 0. So these are the two solutions to that equation. These are the x-intercepts. These are the zeros. Remember, the zeros refer to when y is 0, which of course gives you the x-intercepts. Another definition, roots. Roots are another way just to say solutions, the roots of an equation. Notice that this equation here doesn't have a y equal, and that's really the only difference. If I find the roots here, I would get it equal to 0, x squared, and I move these over, add them to both sides. I get x squared plus 10x plus 24 equals 0. And yes, if this was a y equal equation, the solutions or roots would be zeros. Factor this. X times x is x squared. This number times this number makes positive 24. So it's either two positives or two negatives to make positive 24. Since the middle is a plus, it's got to be the two positives. Factors of 24 that add to 10 are 4 and 6. And just like up above, the solutions are what you plug in that creates 0. Negative 4, because negative 4 plus 4 is 0, and 0 times anything makes 0. And then negative 6 is my other answer, because negative 6 plus 6 is 0, and 0 times anything makes 0. So these are the solutions or roots. And if I had a y equals, they would also be called the zeros. We're going to talk about completing the square next, but before we talk about completing the square, I want to remind you that you can solve a quadratic easily when you have a square. I know there are two numbers squared that make 64. They are 8 and negative 8. And what we discovered is that we can eliminate a square with a square root. A square and a square root are inverses of each other, just like addition, subtraction, or multiplication and division. If I take the square root of both sides, I get x equals 8. The problem is that's not the answer. The answer is positive 8 because 8 squared is 64, and negative 8 because negative 8 times negative 8 is also positive 64. When we take the square root of both sides, to fix that and make sure we get the right answer, we put a plus or a minus in front of the square root. That means the answers are plus or minus 8, and saying plus or minus 8 is exactly the same thing as listing them separately and saying 8 and negative 8 are my answers. If I have x squared equals 100, I I could take the square root of both sides. There are two numbers squared that make 100, so I put my plus or my minus, and then my answers are plus and minus 10. And you can just leave it like that, but if you want to write 10 and negative 10, which is what we'll have to do in WAMAP, that's perfectly okay too. This idea of eliminating a square with a square root works in other situations too, like the 2 in blue. I can eliminate that square by taking the square root of both sides, and when I take the square root of both sides, I need opposite the variable to put a plus or a minus. That means the square and the square root cancel out. They are inverses of each other. X minus 2 equals plus or minus root 7. We can get x by itself by adding 2 to both sides. Typically what we do is we pop that 2 in front, and we say that x equals positive 2 plus or minus root 7. Technically, there are two answers then. One of them is 2 plus root 7, and the other is 2 minus root 7. And we can check these answers. If we plug them in and subtract 2 and square it, it'll be equal to the 7 that we started with. Good way to do that is on the calculator, or maybe Desmos. Let's take a look at the next one. I can eliminate the square by taking the square root of both sides. The square and the square root eliminate each other, and it's x plus 3 equals, don't forget the plus and minus, because there are two answers to a quadratic, plus or minus, usually, plus or minus the square root of 18. 18 has perfect squares in it. When a number has perfect squares in it, we take those perfect squares, it's 9 times 2. So x plus 3 equals, do not put the square root of 9 in front of the plus or minus. It goes in front of the root. Plus or minus, the square root of 9 is 3. Left underneath is a 2. Plus or minus 3 root 2. Almost done. Take a 3 off each side, and I'll squeeze it over here. My answers are negative 3 plus or minus 3 root 2. Again, we could list those answers out separately. One of them would be negative 3 plus 3 root 2, and the other answer would be negative 3 minus 3 root 2. And these and this are the same answer. This next concept is hugely important because we're going to learn to complete the square. First, you need to understand what makes a square a square. What I've done is I FOILed out three squares: x minus 7 squared, x plus 3, quantity squared, quantity makes parentheses, and x minus 5, quantity squared. Note that when you square, you FOIL. X times x is x squared, x times negative 7 is negative 7x, negative 7 times x is negative 7x, and negative 7 times negative 7 is positive 49. So our middle becomes negative 14x, and our last number there is 49. Now these numbers I've underlined, it turns out there's a relationship between the two, and that's what you need to understand to complete the square. Look at the 6 and the 9 in the blue. I squared that. 9 and 6. Take a look at the red one. 25 and 5. So what you need to understand is that if I have this number here, how do I create that number? If I have the number here, how do I create that number? Same thing here. If I have the minus 10, how can I figure out the plus 25? First, notice that the last sign is always positive because it's either going to be two negatives or two positives. Like in the first one, it was x minus 7 times x minus 7. And the second one was x plus 3 times x plus 3. And on the last one, it was x minus 5 times x minus 5. It's either going to be two negatives or two positives if it's a square. Well, the 14, notice that if you take half of it, 7, and square it, you get 49. The 6, notice if you take half of it, 3, and square it, you get 9. The minus 10, again, this is the trick. Take half of it, negative 5, yeah. You get square it, you get positive 25. You don't really have to worry about the negative because when you square it, it becomes positive. What number would make these below perfect squares? The negative 18, take half of it, that's negative 9, square it, that's positive 81. X squared minus 18x plus 81. And what would that be? Well, it would be x times x makes x squared, 9 times 9 makes 81, and I need to make this a positive, so it's either two positives or two negatives to make positive 81. And since the middle is a negative, it's two negatives. In other words, this is x minus 9 quantity squared. Take a look at the last one. Take the 20, take half, you get 10. Square it, you get 100. That's x squared plus 20x plus 100. This is something times something, x and x, plus and plus, and 10 and 10. So this is equal to x plus 10 squared. So the thing you need to understand from this page is that if I have a middle number and I want to make a square, I take half of it and square it, and that will make that a perfect square. Here are the steps to solve by completing the square. First thing is to get the variables on one side and the constant, the number, in this case the minus 7, on the other. If there's a coefficient in front of the squared term, eliminate it. Divide everything by 2 or by 3. If there's a 5 in front of that, divide everything by 5. This can make some messy numbers. Step 3 is the magical step. Take half the coefficient of x, whatever your variable is, that in this case is the 12, square it, and add it to both sides, and then you solve. So let's give this a try. We're going to get the variables on one side, x squared plus 12x, and we'll add 7 to both sides, so it equals 7. We eliminate the coefficient of the squared term. Since it's just a 1, we're good to go. But if it was a 5 or 6, I would divide everything by 5 or everything by 6. Now take half the coefficient of x. This is the coefficient. It's 12. I'll take 1/2 of 12. The reason I wrote the half is because if you have a fraction like 5/3, you want to multiply it by half to take half of it. It's just easier. 1/2 times 12 is 6. 12 divided by 2. And then you take that 6 and you square it. 6 squared is 36. And you add that to both sides. X squared plus 12x plus 36 equals 7 plus 36. This is a perfect square. If you follow this step, it always will be every single time. Are there any factors of 36 that add to 12? Yes, there are. They're 6 and 6. So in fact, this is x plus 6 times x plus 6, or x plus 6 squared equals 43. Now we can solve by taking the square to both sides. Don't forget to put the plus or minus. There are two answers, and we'll talk about that in class later, why that is. Usually there's two. There can be 1, 2, or none, but most of the time there's going to be 2. X plus 6 equals plus or minus root 43. Check to make sure your square root doesn't have any perfect squares that divide evenly into it, like 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and so on. It doesn't. It's prime, I believe. So get x by itself, take a 6 off each side, and typically you put that 6 in front, and here you would say your answer then is negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 43. If you need to, in WAMAP, for example, you can write that as two answers, negative 6 plus root 43, comma, negative 6 minus root 43. I intentionally made this one messy just to show you what it looks like. The first thing we do is get the constant on the other side. Get the variables on one side by themselves. 2x squared minus 3x equals 5. The next thing we do is make sure the coefficient of your squared term is 1. Divide every term by 2. So that would be x squared minus 3 halves x equals 5 halves. Next, we'll take half the coefficient of x. That's 1/2 of negative 3 halves. And you don't need to include the negative because you're going to square it. It's going to end up being positive. This would be negative 3/4. Then we'll take the negative 3/4 and we will square it. That'll be 9/16. And we'll add that to both sides. X squared minus 3 halves x plus 9/16 equals 5 halves plus 9/16. This may not look like it, but it is a perfect square. I promise you. It'll be x, and you know both signs will be negative because you got a positive 9/16 and you have a minus in the middle, minus. And it needs to be a square. 3 times 3 is 9, and 4 times 4 is 16. Over here, we need a common denominator. Common denominator of 2 and 16 is 16, so I'll multiply 5 halves by 8 over 8. I'm multiplying it by 1. It doesn't change the value. That would be 40 over 16 plus 9 over 16. X minus 3/4 squared equals 49 over 16. We will square root both sides and put our plus or minus in front. That's x minus 3/4 equals plus or minus. Square root of 49 is 7. Square root of 16 is 4. Almost there. We'll add 3/4 to both sides. Add 3/4. And x will equal 3/4 plus or minus 7/4. This is two answers. One would be 3/4 plus 7/4, which equals 10/4. Both 10 and 4 are even. That's 5 halves, or 2.5. If it's a messy decimal, make sure you leave it a fraction. The other one is 3/4 minus 7/4, which is negative 4/4, which is negative 1. So our two answers are 5 halves and negative 1. The last concept in this lesson, which is easier than what we just did, is how do we write a function with a given set of zeros, with a given set of x-intercepts? And it turns out not to be too difficult. Go back to what makes a solution. When does y equal 0? Remember, in this case, it's just an example, that y would be 0 when x would be 7, because 7 minus 7 is 0, and when x was equal to negative 2, because negative 2 plus 2 is 0. In other words, your equation needs to make it so that when I plug in negative 3, it creates 0. That tells you that one of the factors is x plus 3, because if I plug in that negative 3 plus 3 will be 0. The other factor needs to make 5 a 0. X minus 5 would be that factor, because when I plug in positive 5, 5 minus 5 is 0. Then what you're going to do is FOIL it out, multiply x to both of them, y equal x squared minus 5x, and then take the negative 3 to both of them. Positive 3 times x is positive 3x, and positive 3 times negative 5 is negative 15. So the equation that would have zeros of negative 3 and 5, the simplest equation anyway, would be y equal x squared minus 2x minus 15. I'll prove it to you. I'm going to bring up Desmos. This is the equation we discovered, y equal x squared minus 2x minus 15. Notice the zeros. That's when y is 0. That's the x-intercepts. notice the zeros are, just like they're supposed to be, -3 and 5. The remainder of this video is examples from your assignment. So if at any time you have difficulty, go find the question that's closest to the one you're working on and you have some help. Let's take a look at this first one. Find the zeros of the given function. Zeros are when y is 0 and f of x is just y. So we're solving the equation 0 equals x squared minus 81. There are actually two ways we could solve this equation. We could solve for the square, add 81 to both sides, and we have x squared equals 81. Take the square root of both sides, plus or minus, and x would be plus or minus 9. You're going to need to list that as two answers, 9 and -9, or -9 and 9. You put a comma in there. Another way you could have solved that is by factoring a difference of squares. This is x plus 9 times x minus 9. The answers are the x value that you plug into x and create 0, -9 because -9 plus 9 is 0, and 9 because 9 minus 9 is 0. So -9 and 9 are your answers. Find the zeros of this function. 0 equals x times 6x plus 7. One answer is 0, x equals 0, because 0 times anything makes 0. The other answer is going to be a fraction. So what you do if you can't easily tell what value of x creates 0 is you set it equal to 0. What value makes 6x plus 7 0? That's what we're trying to discover. Move the 7 to the other side, subtract it. 6x equals -7, and divide by 6. And you get x equals -7/6. You're not supposed to have decimals. That would be 0 and -7/6 for your answers. Just to point out, you can pretty easily see that -7/6 is a 0, because if you put that in place of x, you put a -7/6 in place of x, the 6's cancel, and -7 plus 7 is 0, and 0 times anything is 0. Find the zeros of this function. Question 4. 0 equals x squared minus 14x plus 33. Are there any factors of 33 that add to 14? We can do that because there's just a 1 in front. How about 3 and 11? 0 equals x minus 3 times x minus 11. Note that -3x and -11x make -14 when you FOIL, and -3 times -11 is positive 33. The answers are what values of x you plug in that make 0, 3, and 11. This looks a little like the one we did earlier. A GCF is what we have. X squared minus 3x. This is x times x minus 3. The first thing you always should look for is a greatest common factor. What value of x creates 0? X equals 0 creates 0, because 0 times x minus 3 would be 0. And the other answer would be x equals 3, because 3 minus 3 is 0. 0 and 3 are my answers. We can complete the square on this one, or we could see if it factors. Notice that there is a GCF and everything. When I have 0 equals 10x squared minus 22x plus 4, our equation has a GCF of 2. We could pull that 2 out, or this is an equation that's equal to 0. I can just divide both sides by 2. 0 equals 5x squared minus 11x plus 2. Let's see if this factors. I'll take the 5 and the 2 and multiply them, and I get 10. Are there any factors of 10 that add to -11? negative 10 and negative 1. Negative 10 times negative 1 is positive 10, and negative 10 plus negative 1 is negative 11. Let's rewrite the middle term. 5x squared. I'm going to put the 10 next because it goes with the 5 nicely. Minus 10x minus 1x plus 2. Notice that negative 10 plus negative 1 is negative 11. I'm going to group now and pair them up. The first two have a 5x in them. 5x times x minus 2. The last two have a common factor of 1, and that's it. You need to put the 1. You got to have something there. Negative 1 times something makes negative 1x. That would be x. Negative 1 times something makes positive 2. That would be negative 2. Now I have two terms separated by this subtraction right here. Both have x minus 2 in them. This is equal to 0. X minus 2. When I pull the x minus 2 out of the first term, I'm left with 5x. And out of the second term, I'm left with minus 1. The answers are the values of x that you plug in that create 0. Here it would be x equal 2, because 2 minus 2 is 0. For this one, it's going to be a fraction. We can go over here and set it equal to 0. If we don't know what makes 5x minus 1 0, put it equal to 0. Move the 1 over. 5x equals positive 1. Add 1 to both sides and divide by 5. And there's your answer, negative 1/5. You can learn to do this in your head, but just be careful. I always get students that think they got it down and they make a silly mistake when it comes test time. The final answers then are x equals 2 and x equals negative 1/5. So put those in separated by a comma. Here we have 20x squared plus 2 equals 13x. This is a standard form, but it's not written in standard form. I need to move the 13x over between the 20x squared and the 2. Subtract 13x from each side and you get 20x squared minus 13x plus 2 equals 0. Before we try anything like completing the square, let's see if it factors. 20 times 2 is 40. Are there any factors of 40, two numbers that multiply to 40, that add to negative 13? How about 8 and 5? So negative 8 times negative 5 makes positive 40. Negative 8 plus negative 5 makes negative 13. Let's rewrite the middle term, 20x squared, and I'll put the either one. How about the minus 8x minus 5x plus 2? Let's group them and pair them up. The first two terms have a 4x in them. 4x times 5x minus 2. Bring down that minus. Nothing but a 1 in the last two terms. 1 times positive 5x, because negative 1 times 5x is negative 5x. And negative 2, because negative 1 times negative 2 is positive 2. Both terms have 5x minus 2 in them. 5x minus 2 times 4x minus 1. There are two answers. The answers are what you plug in that makes 0, and they're both fractions. If we don't know what it is off the top of our head, set it equal to 0. 5x minus 2 equals 0. 5x equals 2, and divide by 5. So there's one of them, 2/5. Set 4x minus 1 equal to 0, and we'll find the number that makes 0. 4x equals 1, and divide by 4, and 1/4 is our other answer. 2/5 and 1/4 is the final answer. Write a quadratic function in standard form for the given set of zeros. If negative 12 is a 0, we need a factor that when you plug in negative 12 makes 0. That would be x plus 12. Plug negative 12 into that and you get 0. The other one would be x plus 11, because if you plug negative 11 into that, you get 0. What we need to do is FOIL then, take the x to both, take the 12 to both. y equals x squared plus 11x plus 12x plus 132. And our final answer is y equals x squared plus 23x plus 132. Another example. What factor would create a 0, 12? X minus 12. And what value or factor would create negative 2 is 0? X plus 2. And we'll FOIL it out. Take the x to both. Y equals x squared plus 2x. And take the negative 12 to both. Negative 12x minus 24. And our final answer is x squared minus 10x minus 24. This is a really quick one. It's the idea that to find the number that makes the square, you need to take half the coefficient of x. So take half of 2, multiply it by half, and you get 1. Square it. And if we were solving an equation, we would add this to both sides, but here we're just making the square. What value makes a square? That would be 1. 1 squared is 1. And when you factor this, it's x squared plus 2x plus 1. It would be x times x makes x squared. This number times this number makes positive 1. What factors of 1 add to 2? How about 1 and 1? The simplified answer then is x plus 1 squared, and that's what they're looking for in the box. This is the same thing, but it's a heck of a lot messier because of the 7 doesn't divide by 2 nicely. First thing we'll do is take negative 7, and you don't need the negative. Remember, you're going to square it, so it's going to be positive, but I'll keep it there for a moment. I'm going to take half of that. That's negative 7 halves. And then I'm going to take negative 7 halves and square it, and I get 49 over 4. So this is 49 over 4. This is something squared. X squared minus 7x plus 49 over 4 is something times something. It's going to be two negatives to make that a positive, and in the middle a negative. And 7 times 7 is 49, and 2 times 2 is 4. So this is x minus 7 halves quantity squared. Another example, question 19 with yucky numbers. First step to create a square is to take half of it. We'll take negative 5/3 and take half of negative 5/3. That's negative 5/6. Take negative 5/6 and square it, and you get 25 over 36. And if you were solving the equation, you'd add that to both sides. It doesn't look like it, but it is. Every time you do the half and square it, you get a perfect square. We know that it is negative and negative to make the positive, but the middle a negative because these two will add to negative 5/3, the outer and the inner. It's going to be 5 times 5 to make 25, and 6 times 6 to make 36. X minus 5/6 quantity squared is our answer. We're getting ready to complete the square. This is what it looks like after you create the square. We're just going to solve this quickly. X minus 19 squared equals 36. It's going to have a nice answer because 36 is a square. When I square root both sides, I need that plus or minus to get both my answers. X minus 19 equals plus or minus 6. Now to get x by itself, I'll add 19 to both sides and I'll pop that in front. And x equals 19 plus or minus 6. There are two answers then. One is 19 plus 6, which is 25. The other is 19 minus 6, which is 13. 25 and 13 are the answers. This question is another that's leading up to completing the square, and the hint is the key here. this is a perfect square. Something times something makes that, and in fact it's t plus 5 times t plus 5 equals 169. Notice that 5 times 5 makes positive 25, and 5t and 5t make 10t. When you FOIL, outer and inner, always create the middle term. We have t plus 5 squared equals 169. Now we can eliminate the square by taking the square root of both sides and put that plus or minus there. We have t plus 5 equals plus or minus 13. We will take a 5 off each side and we'll pop that negative 5 in front. T equals negative 5 plus or minus 13. Just to point out, if this had been a square root, it's not. And the two answers have been negative 5 plus root 13 and negative 5 minus root 13. Again, this is not the answer. I'm just pointing out that you can't add these things without approximating. They're not like terms. Reminder that root 7 plus root 7 is not root 14, it's 2 root 7. And I can only add roots if they're like terms. If I ask you to add 2 and root 5, you can't do that. It's not equal to 2 root 5 because that's 2 times root 5. They both have to have the same root, just like when you add like terms with variables, they both have to have the same variable. So be aware of that. If there's a root, then you can't go any farther. You'd look and see if you could simplify the root. But here, what I have is negative 5 plus or minus 13. And these are both just regular old plain numbers. I can add them, so I need to keep going. One answer is negative 5 plus 13, which is 8. And the other answer is negative 5 minus 13, which is negative 18. And if you plug these numbers in for your t, you'll discover that they make the equation true. List them with a comma, 8 and negative 18, and you're done. This is completing the square in steps to help you get the steps down. The first step is to subtract 27 from both sides and enter the results below. This would be x squared minus 12x. And when I move the 27 to the other side, I subtract it. So on the other side, it'll be negative 27. Now we take this number, the negative 12. Negative 12, we'll take half of it. That's negative 6. And then we'll square it. Negative 6 squared is 36. And we'll add that to both sides. We're going to add 36 to the left side and add 36 to the right side. This is x squared minus 12x plus 36 equals negative 27 plus 36 is 9. Now we're getting close to the point where we could solve it. We'll factor this. That becomes x minus 6 squared because negative 6 times negative 6 is positive 36, and negative 6 plus negative 6 is negative 12, and that would be equal to 9. And this is the answer for this question. On the next question, I believe we will solve it. Solve this equation by completing the square. First step is to move the 32 to the other side. Negative 2x squared minus 12x equals negative 32. The next step is to make the coefficient of the squared term 1. We'll divide everything by negative 2. This becomes x squared plus 6x equals 16. We'll take this number and take half. That would be 3, and square it. That would be 9, and we'll add 9 to both sides. X squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 25. We're going to make this a perfect square. It would be x plus 3 squared equals 25. Square root both sides, plus or minus. And x plus 3 will equal plus or minus 5. Take a 3 off each side, and x would be negative 3 plus or minus 5. There are two answers. One is negative 3 plus 5, which is 2, and the other is negative 3 minus 5, which is negative 8. So 2 and negative 8 are answers. Here's the last example, and this is a little bit messy, you'll discover. And most of the time you get messy answers. That's why you're completing the square. When you get nice answers, you're going to want to factor. That's the quickest and easiest technique. Let's complete the square on this and see what happens. The first step is to move the negative 4 to the other side. 4z squared plus 3z equals 4. The next step is to make the coefficient of your squared term 1. We'll divide everything by 4. And we have z squared plus 3/4 z equals 1. We'll take half of 3/4, multiply it by half. We get 3/8. We'll take 3/8 and we'll square it. Notice I'm not putting an equal here because they're not equal. 3/8 is 9/64, and add 9/64 to both sides. Z squared plus 3/4 z plus 9/64 equals 1 plus 9/64. That 1 needs a common denominator. The common denominator would be 64. So I'll multiply the top and the bottom by 64, 64/64. In other words, what I have is z squared plus 3/4 z plus 9/64 equals 64/64 plus 9/64. Notice how that's 1. This is a perfect square. It's z plus 3 times 3 is 9, 8 times 8 is 64, and this is 73/64. Now we can take the square root of both sides and put our plus or minus there. I'm going to split this root up into root 73 over root 64. Because the square of 64 will be 8. So this is z plus 3/8 equals plus or minus root 73 over 8. I'm going to move the 3/8 to the other side. I'll subtract 3/8 from both sides. And I get z equals negative 3/8 plus or minus root 73 over 8. The common denominator is 8, and it's already there, so I'll combine them all over 8, and I get negative 3 plus or minus root 73 all over 8. When we list the answer here, we're going to have to list it as two answers. One is negative 3 plus root 73 over 8. The other answer is negative 3 minus root 73 all over 8. Separate them by a comma.